So the first piece is the piece on myth itself and Jung. You know how we got involved with that area with the psyche and thing. Uh, Myths, as we know, are very ancient stories. And the story we're dealing with the arrival of the Tuatha De Danann to Ireland happened uh, about at least 500 BC before Christ. And uh, it tells the story of their arrival in Ireland. Now, the first time that these stories were written down was about between 5 and 800 AD post Christ. So you can imagine that it went from mouth to mouth, as they say. It was the stories were told in between. That's what kept them alive. And in fact, storytelling continued in Ireland. Even when I was a child myself, there was a Shanachie, a storyteller, and people would gather in houses at night. And I was a kid, you know, when all this was going, because television came in then, it took all this away. But it was the way that Irish country people lived, really listening to myths, and it held them, you know, through the years. Of um, when you think of all the you know, colonization and everything that happened, this held the soul of Irish people together. I really do believe, listening to Irish myths. So we have that to think about. Then arrives television, and that seemed to do away with it, but they're still around, these stories. Uh, so yes, and now we go to Jung himself, Carl Jung, who was a psychiatrist in Zurich, and that would have been in the late 1930s and the 1940s, say. And at the same time, Freud was in Vienna working, and at that stage, Freud himself had discovered the made studies anyway of consciousness and of the personal unconscious, which is consisted of the shadow really, and is had to do with repression, all the different defenses of the ego. Let's say he had all the different defenses that were involved in the ego succeeded in repressing and pushing down a lot of things that consciousness couldn't deal with. And they remained there in the shadow. Now, the shadow also, which was what Jung's discovery, is the shadow also contains stuff that was developmental, but didn't find its way into consciousness for one reason or another, because of the defenses of the ego. They didn't find their way into consciousness. So as well as the suppression and the repression, there was potential in the shadow too. So Freud had discovered all this. He had discovered the ego and the you know, the functions of the ego and the way consciousness worked, and its relationship with the unconscious. But it was the personal unconscious, which was the shadow really. So that's where it was at when Jung met Freud in Vienna. So Freud took a great liking to Jung, and he really wanted him to stay in Vienna. Well, Jung must have gone there to study something or other. And Freud really wanted him to stay. He wanted him to be president of the new psychoanalytic association in Vienna. But there was something else drawing Jung. Jung was actually quite introverted, and I think he was an intuitive, you know, and he really would have liked to oblige Freud, because Freud was getting old at this stage, you know, and he would have, and Jung was quite a young man. He'd have been a man in his 28 or 29, I'd say, at that age. And but Jung found himself drawn. He really wanted to work on his own. He really wanted to listen to something he didn't know what at the time, but he was totally drawn to that. So he decided to leave Vienna, and it's said that himself and Freud didn't speak again, but that's not really true, because they did make journeys together to America from time to time to talk to them when they were invited to meetings. So uh, Jung then set off for Zurich, where he bought a house. He got married. He lived beside the lake. I don't know if you've been to Zurich or the institute there. It's where the Jungian Institute is there today. And that's where Jungian analysts are trained, really, in Europe. Yeah. So he withdrew to that place. And then he became very, very interested in in something that was happening inside in himself, and something that he found also in mythology. Well, mythology, I suppose, is the study of myth, but myth is the story itself. But he found that he was and in fairy tales and in his own dreams. So he spent years looking at aspects of his own dreams, which were very interesting, amazing type of dreams in a way, and fairy tales and mythology. So he was reading that, and then he discovered another layer of the unconscious, which I thought, that I'm not 100% certain whether it was Jung called it the collective unconscious. I think so, but that's what it's called. And it was the reason why it's called the collective unconscious. Because it is completely unrelated to consciousness. It exists deep down in the psyche, and it contains all the experiences of humanity from the very beginning of humanity. It contains they're not available to consciousness, but there they are. And it contains, it's the collective unconscious because it pertains to every single person in the world, irrespective of whether they're rich or wealthy or healthy or unhealthy or big or small. The collective unconscious exists in every single human person. And it contains potential, really, for human development. And it presents itself, it's not related but to consciousness, but it presents itself in images. These are the images that are present in a lot of myths, stories. The stories that are contained in myths are those images that emerge from the collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious, Jung discovered, I'm going to take a drink. The collective unconscious, Jung discovered, is entirely composed of archetypes. And what are archetypes? Archetypes are like containers of high energy about a certain primeval that's reaching into the present, a primeval image, let's say, something. If they appear in dreams too, and he noticed it in his own existence because they were reaching into his own personal life at the moment. But it wasn't the consciousness that was reaching into it, really. It was it that was reaching into consciousness. And these are called archetypal experiences. And these are present that's what myth is really formed of. So we notice in this story that it's very kind of sort of, arriving in a cloud in a country. We probably arrive by air today, but we wouldn't be in a cloud, really, and the stories are kind of, they use they're stories of the imagination, really, aren't they? A lot of mythology is the imagination speaking to us. So they're very important in that respect because they contain within themselves the we oftentimes we don't notice them now at all because we're not paying it, we're not attending to it. You know, it isn't on. We haven't taken it into consideration. But our dreams and the stories, particularly the mythology of our own country, tells us something and has some message for us that promotes our that when I say promotes, I mean that develops us more. They're entirely the the stories that come from the collective unconscious, let's say in the form of dreams or in the form of thing, are very they have to do with human development, really. So they do develop people. You know, they even though, you know, by even kind of being staying with it without understanding it at all, because consciousness tends to want to break things down into particles, you know, and make rational meaning with them. But these things are irrational, but they have huge meaning, and that's what Jung brought. Plus, he brought as well a knowledge of a deeper still great archetype, which is called the archetype of the self, and from which most spirituality in human beings emerges. The ego itself emerged as an archetype from the self, and the ego it travels when we die. You know, when we're older, as I am, for example, the ego is traveling back again towards the archetype of the self. There is an atmosphere of magic and mystery surrounding the Toa De Danann anyway, isn't there? You know, it kind of isn't limited by consciousness in any way. You know, it's kind of a place where the magic can happen. And they're coming to Ireland in obscure clouds and landing on a mountain in the west of Ireland, and the sun that gets eclipsed for 3 days. All those sort of natural kind of big natural events are happening with their arrival. So it's kind of resonating with the whole universe in a way for Ireland, isn't it? When that sort of thing happens, then they bring with them as they arrive, they bring with them the 4 gifts. They have the sword, they have the spear, they have there's there's the cauldron, and there's the leofold. So they're kind of 4 quite different things in a way. But I feel that if we look at Jung's personality type studies and his, you know, one looks at one's own personality type then naturally, and and these 4 gifts, in a way, in some way, I think they symbolize some of or could be vice the other way around too, that they symbolize the 4 functions, which were thinking and feeling are 2 rational functions. Feeling may not feel always a very rational function to us, but there's intuition and there's sensation, the other 2, which are kind of they're the non-judgment, even though feeling may not feel, but there is a way in which when we're feeling, we are making a judgment about something. It might be unconsciously, but the others are given functions that happen inside in us, both sensation and intuition. I'll just go through. We know that the sword, for example, it was called the sword of light, and we think of sword and we think of kind of chopping through things with the sword. You know, it's kind of for kind of for chopping, mainly used for human beings in the past, but I don't think that swords are used anymore. But they may be used for chopping wood or something now, I'm not sure. But they are, and that in a way equates with the feeling, but with the thinking function, I think, you know, because the thinking function, uh, these were. Let me just go through the gifts first. There was the sword, there's the spear, which was the spear of victory, and it was the spear that Lulav Ada, Lu, used as he was a miraculous winner, if you like, in battles and in kind of, he was a miraculous kind of in most of the stories, Lu achieves miracles in some way or other. And then there was the spear that which Lu had, and there's the leafall, which is the stone on which the kings were were formulated as kings, and it was taken away to Scotland in before the Middle Ages, in fact. And from Scotland, it was brought to London, and now it's there present when when there's a new king or queen being reigning, being coming into reign anyway in England. So it's in some way they're all present still. The cauldron too is the thing that Douglas called it. It was known as the cauldron of plenty, because it was never empty, no matter how many people came to eat. The cauldron itself was never empty. And you think of the things that the symbolic significance of the cauldron in the chalice, for example, with its containment of the bread, what the Christian churches call the bread of life, you know, in some way that symbolizes too the same thing as the cauldron symbolized, I think. The early cauldron, you know, I think it symbolizes the possibility of having life, you know, and of course food supports life anyway, doesn't it? Maybe not too much of it, but food, we all need food. So these were the four gifts that they brought. And Jung himself, then, would be very recent relative to the bringing of these gifts to Ireland by the Tuatha Dé Danann. But speaking of Jung himself, as we looked at earlier, he studied, analytical psychology. Through himself, through mythology, through fairy tales, through dreams, through his own dreams, he built up a knowledge of the internal self, let's say. And what he discovered in the process was that there were particular types of personality that developed automatically. You know, I don't think they're not even genetic, you know, really, but that each person is going to have let's say, there's that he found that there were four different types of personality. And when we talk about the type of personality, we're talking about the one of these: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. We're talking about the one that is at the top, that sits in consciousness, and therefore that is going to have a bigger conscious effect anyway, the one that's in consciousness. So he was looking at all this, and he discovered it. He discovered that the thinking, feeling, felt that those two ones were ones in which judgment, thinking more so than feeling in a way, but that there is some inner judgment in relation to feeling, and that the other two, sensation and intuition, that they are at another level entirely. They are they don't have anything at all to do with consciousness, really. They just are they're givens in life. If we have if we have one of those in as our superior function, the one that consciousness holds.
Yeah, Maureen, so, just quickly, the spear, that's intuition, isn't it? The spear.
No, I think the stone is intuition, really.
Okay.
Who intuits it. I feel that the spear, because the spear always goes to a point. It gets to its point, particularly in the hand of Lula Vada. It gets to its point, and for that reason, I think that it's sensation, really.
Okay.
Yeah, and that the sword, which cuts through things, is thinking.
And the cauldron is feeling.
And the cauldron of plenty is feeling.
Right.
Yeah. And the number 4 itself is interesting too, isn't it? Because it's a number of completion. You know, the 4 gifts. The number 4 itself, it's supposed to be a feminine number too. And it's a number of completion. So these 4 gifts, if you include all the people of the world and think of them all as being, that these make up something that's evolutionary significant in human beings. The development of these gifts is evolutionary significant, and each person, even though we mightn't be conscious of it, but we're functioning with one of those gifts. If we're a thinking person, we're fairly logical, really, in a way. You know, we analyze things in a logical way. So by being so rational, it has its own depth, but it excludes a lot, doesn't it? It will oftentimes exclude feeling, because feeling, if thinking is in the superior function, feeling is the inferior function. So therefore, feeling would tend to be more negative, actually, than positive. You know,
so Maureen, you're not saying that somebody whose dominant function is thinking and their inferior function is feeling, that the thinking person isn't without feeling, but it's that they haven't developed that. And didn't Jung say that very often the gem is in the inferior function?
Yes. Well, in the inferior function is a much more difficult to access, actually, and tends to work in a negative way. The other 2 functions are at the side. If thinking is in the superior function, it's one of the other functions that will be developed next. And then the 3rd function on the other side. And the inferior function is very hard to develop and oftentimes works in a negative way.
And so the Tuatha Dé Danann brought these 4 human gifts to Ireland.
Yes. Yeah.
In a cloud. And they were the goddess people too, weren't they?
They were. You see, they were, and the goddess people, they were very, at the time that the Tuatha Dé Danann, like there was a story that Danu herself, but there are interesting tellings of the Tuatha Dé Danann, that Danu herself, that there was the center of the Danube, you know, and that through having sexual contact with a tree that called Bile, that they begot the Dagda. Yeah, you know, and that after that, then they must have come to Ireland. But that's, you know, a part of a story too that exists, you know. Yeah. Ellen, were you finished with what you were saying there?
Yeah, no. I just wanted you to maybe say a little bit more about that. But you did. That's fine. Thanks, Maureen.
Yeah. Okay.
So in a way, the task for a Jungian then would be bringing the 4 gifts. For an individual would be bringing the 4 gifts. They would tend to have either sword, spear, cauldron, or stone in the ascendancy.
Yeah.
And then the task of, I think, what you call individuation would be to develop some of the other functions.
Yes.
And the particularly difficult one would be the inferior one.
And that would be, I mean, I think Jung himself said that it's not possible to bring that to, but maybe as life goes by, you see, it becomes possible. But it can't develop before the other two develop. You know,
right?
You know, in the ones at the side.
And in relation to the Lu against Balor of the Evil Eye, would it be fair to say that the Battle of Oitura could be seen as a battle between the, if we looked at it psychologically, between the superior function, say Lu, and is Balor the shadow?
Yeah.
Could Balor be seen as the shadow?
Yeah, you could interpret it. You could think psychologically about it, that or experience it psychologically as that. The same as the Tuatha had row at their fight with the Fomorians.
Yeah.
And Fomor, they, you know, also, and Fomori means free wood, under earth, under the sea. They were the dark forces, isn't it? They lived under the sea.
Right. So,
you know, free wood. Yeah.
Which you could easily see as under the sea being the unconscious.
Yes, you could.
Yeah.
But these were very dark forces that were there. And sometimes that's true, you see, that there are dark forces in the unconscious that people have to deal with, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
Maureen, could you tell us a bit about projection? Because it seems like there's a lot of projecting going on in the political sphere these days. Yeah. What exactly, tell us what projection is.
Projection, I think, is one of the defenses of the ego. And the ego comes, let's say, it emerges from the self, and it's like a very delicate thing. Yeah, really, you know, in its own way, when it's young, you know, think of a small little child, you know, think of a baby and his ego, and he has to develop, isn't it, in the context of a relationship with parents or with siblings. Yeah. So the ego is developing all the time while a person is a child, you know, and is growing up. And if hopefully it will kind of through a relationship with its parents, it will grow to be able to be contained and very, you know, very in tune. But it automatically, as it develops defenses, these are they develop in everybody. Right. And the one that you asked, that talked about there, which was projection, it means you see all the time, even in childhood, the shadow is being built up, really. Right. You know, it's a natural force. The shadow has things that are positive, but there are a lot of things that are rejected by the ego so that the ego itself could grow. Right. They can't be contained in the ego. So therefore, those things are lying there as it depends and the ego. But what we do sometimes is project it into somebody else. We accuse somebody else of a characteristic which is unconscious, which is in the personal unconscious in ourselves.